Hello, I'm Adrienne Resha, a PhD candidate in American Studies at the College of William and Mary, and in this video, I'm presenting Thoth, Justice, and the American Way, Egyptian Myth, Modern Egypt, and Superhero Comics for ICAF's virtual 2020 conference. Throughout the presentation, slides will have QR codes that can be scanned with the camera of a smartphone or tablet. They'll direct you to the sources that I reference. Since the 1940s, American comic book creators working in the superhero genre have demonstrated a fascination with an ambiguous and amorphous East. Today, that region may be understood as being inclusive of the Arab-majority nations of the Middle East and North Africa. While that early fascination resulted in a number of superheroes whose power sets and personas were derived, however loosely, from Egyptian mythology, it did not produce Arab superheroes. Instead, Golden Age characters like Hawkman, Dr. Fate, and Ibis the Invincible were ancient Egyptians, wielders of ancient Egyptian magical artifacts, or both. Over 80 years, the origins of Hawkman have alternated between ancient Egypt and the planet of Thanagar, but the character has never been made Arab American. After 9/11, the Egyptian American Danny Khalifa inherited the Ibis stick and became Ibis the Invincible. After the Arab Spring protests began in late 2010, early 2011, beginning in Egypt on January 25, 2011, the Egyptian Khalid bin Hassan and the Egyptian American Khalid Nasor were made to wear helmets of fate, the former outside of DC Comics' primary continuity, and the latter within it. The origin stories of Egyptian American legacy heroes Khalifa and Nasor are examples of repatriation. In them, fictional Egyptian artifacts from the golden age of comic books are given to newly created modern and Blue Age Arab American characters. For more on the Blue Age, see my article, The Blue Age of Comic Books, in Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society. Repatriation may also be understood as a combination of Egyptianization and Americanization. In Arab comic strips, Politics of an Emerging Mass Culture, Alan Douglas and Fedwa Multi-Douglas use the term Egyptianization to refer to the application of pharaonic, from pharaoh, imagery to supplementary material in American comics that were translated into Arabic and sold in the Middle East and North Africa in the 1970s. I use Egyptianization to refer to the application of the pharaonic aesthetic to American superheroes in the 20th and 21st centuries, from Hawkman, Dr. Fate, and Ibis the Invincible in 1940 to 2007's Ibis and 2015's Fate. I use Americanization to refer to the ways in which the American superhero aesthetic has been applied to Arab characters after 9/11 and the Arab Spring. I argue that repatriation alienates and assimilates the Egyptian American superheroes it affects. Repatriation alienates them by conflating ancient Egyptians and modern Arabs, effectively erasing living Arab Egyptians, and it does so both in the use of the pharaonic aesthetic in the artwork of their comics, especially their respective costumes, and in making these American characters descendants of ancient Egyptian royalty. Further, it assimilates them by making them into comic book superheroes. In 2007, Daniel Danny Kassim Khalifa was introduced in the event one-shot The Helmet of Fate, Ibis the Invincible #1 by writer Tad Williams, artist Phil Winslade, colorist Chris Chuckery, and letterer Phil Bosman. Set sometime after 9/11, the comic opens on Khalifa being assaulted by white teenagers, one of whom says, quote, "We ought to send all you camel jockeys back to Iraq to get blown up," end quote. Captions clarify that Khalifa is not from Iraq, but his parents are from Egypt, where his paternal family belonged to, quote, "an old, noble line," end quote. And having the Khalifas be descended from royalty, the comic combines ancient and Arab Egyptian identities into one identity that is distant in space and time from the contemporary United States, and distant in time from contemporary modern Egypt. After the bullies leave, Khalifa is magically summoned to an Egyptian temple. The temple is decorated with busts of Egyptian gods, human and animal, as well as with a scarab motif and hieroglyphics. It is unclear where or when exactly this temple is. In it, Khalifa finds the first ibis the Invincible, Prince Amenhotep, who is dying. Rather than bequeath the ibis stick to an Arab Egyptian, Amenhotep gives it and his blessing to Khalifa, an Arab American, and tells him to find Thoth, the Egyptian god of magic, writing, and judgment of the dead. Khalifa returns home, where he borrows books from his father, who is a history professor with an apparent interest in mythology. In all fairness, doing this research has made my library look something like his. Reading those books, Khalifa is framed by Thoth in his ibis form, a silhouetted Anubis, the hawk-headed Horus, and Horus's human-headed parents, Osiris and Isis. Osiris and Isis are notably also the names of DC superheroes, although DC has avoided using the name Isis in recent years. Later, Thoth inscribes Khalifa's name as the new master of the ibis stick, allowing Khalifa to transform into Ibis the Invincible, a superhero whose blue and gold costume is, if not period accurate, then at least evocative of ancient Egyptian clothing, unlike the original Ibis, who wore a suit and a turban in his first appearance in Wiz Comics. As Ibis, a visually aged up Khalifa wears a headdress/cape combo under a diadem. He is shirtless, although his torso is partially covered by an Ibis chest piece. Like many American superheroes, he appears to be wearing briefs over tights tucked into boots. Khalifa is both Arab and American, simultaneously alienated and assimilated when he becomes Ibis. While DC has not published an Ibis the Invincible series starring Khalifa, the character went on to appear in Reign in Hell, a miniseries published between 2008 and 2009, and has made cameos in Justice League Dark, a series I'll talk about more shortly. It was not until 2012 that an Arab American character led an ongoing eponymous superhero title, Simon Baz in and as Green Lantern. A year after Simon Baz, and 2 years after the Arab Spring began, Khalid bin Hassan debuted as Earth-2's Dr. Fate, becoming the first Egyptian to occupy the mantle. While significant, in On Earth-2, Ben Hassan discovers and dons his helmet of fate in Egypt, so this is not repatriation, at least not in the same sense that Danny Khalifa and Khalid Nassor's origin stories are. In 2015, Khalid Nassor was introduced in Paul Levitt's and Sonny Liu's Dr. Fate. Set sometime after the Arab Spring, the comic opens on the Egyptian-American Nassor preparing to begin medical school in the midst of catastrophic flooding caused by Anubis, the god of death in the afterlife. Nassor's mother is an American citizen, and his father is an immigrant from Egypt. Nassor is identified throughout the series as being, through his father, quote, the blood of the pharaohs, end quote. Again, ancient and Arab Egyptian identities are conflated. Taking refuge from the ongoing storm in the Brooklyn Museum, further emphasizing that ancient Egypt and its myths are of the past, Nassor is in the Egyptian exhibit when a statue of Bastet, the goddess of protection and cats, presents him, her chosen one, with the helmet of fate, a magical Egyptian artifact possessed by Nabu, a priest of Thoth in this DC canon. Outside of comics, Nabu is a Mesopotamian god. Nassor, like Khalifa, eventually interacts directly with Thoth, who is identified as the previous master of the helmet. In order to become Fate in Dr. Fate, he never becomes Dr. Fate, which I've written about in 2021's Mixed Race Superheroes collection edited by Sika Dagbovi-Mullins and Eric Berlatsky. Nassor must not only put on the helmet but also privilege his Egyptian ethnic identity over his American national identity. These identities, as represented in his costume, are discrete. The gold helmet of fate and an amulet appear over a blue hoodie and jeans. Later, in Justice League Dark, which is ongoing, when Nassor voluntarily dons the helmet of fate, no longer a chosen one but one who chooses, his costume better blends his ethnic and national identities, combining an ancient Egyptian aesthetic with modern American streetwear. He still wears the helmet of fate, however, he wears it, a blue jumpsuit, a white and gold belt/loincloth combo, with a gold cape pinned to his chest by the aforementioned amulet, and gold sneakers. The loincloth and sneakers are particularly notable because one is very Egyptian and the other very American, but they work together. Whereas before, the Egyptian and American elements were discrete in both form and color, Fate's helmet and amulet gold, Nassor's clothing blue, this new costume effectively combines them. However, As much as I personally love this costume, Justice League Dark has frequently sidelined Nasor, the only person of color on the team, in favor of white characters, including the original Dr. Fate, Kent Nelson. And Nasor is characterized, drawn, and colored inconsistently. Further, the costume still evokes a distant Egyptian past rather than the country's present. Like the reference to 9/11 and Ibis the Invincible, Dr. Fate explicitly references the Arab Spring. Levitz and Liu were not only aware of the mass protests that were happening across North Africa and the Middle East just a few years earlier, but also very much influenced by them. Still, modern Egypt doesn't figure into Nasor's conception of himself in Dr. Fate, or his costume as Fate, and he verbally rejects an association with the Arab Spring. Justice League Dark's Nasor is distanced from his origin story and its context, further removed in time from the beginning of the Arab Spring, although there have been waves of protest since then. The Egyptian-American Nasor is alienated, then assimilated, and these versions of him, the products of different creative teams at different times, coexist. For most of the more than 80 years during which superhero comics have been made, Arabs have been depicted as villains if they have been depicted at all. Meanwhile, ancient Egypt and its mythology have been a source of inspiration, if not outright appropriation, for American superhero comics. In the last 20 years, once after 9/11 and again after the Arab Spring, Arab Americans have been made into superheroes through repatriation. Repatriation occurs whenever magical artifacts from the earlier ages of comic books are given to newly created characters. In these specific instances, repatriation occurs when Danny Khalifa becomes the master of the Ibis Stick and Khalid Nasor dons the Helmet of Fate. The repatriation of the Ibis Stick and the Helmet of Fate, both fictional Egyptian artifacts from DC's Golden Age, to Egyptian Americans Danny Khalifa and Khalid Nasor, alienates and assimilates those characters. As legacy heroes Ibis the Invincible and Dr. Fate, these Arab American superheroes are Egyptianized and Americanized. They are made foreign and familiar as they fight for Thoth, justice, and the American way. Thank you for joining me during this presentation. Thanks to my co-panelists for their presentations, and thanks to ICAF's organizing committee for making this virtual conference happen. I can be reached through my website, adrienneresha.com, or on Twitter @AdrienneResha.